Um, all right, good morning, folks. Good to see you all here today. And we are going to dive in and not wait for the slackers. Um, we are on week 3 of this 4-week class that we are doing on um, racism in America, titled Torn at the Cross. For those of you who were here last week, you remember we talked a little bit about those troubling times of the Jim Crow laws, of, um, of lynchings that happened across the South. We went on to reflect a little bit of what is called the Great Migration, where masses of black people moved from the South to the North, primarily to escape the Jim Crow laws, but also to avail themselves of these jobs that a fast industrializing North saw growing. And so there were opportunities for black people in the North that did not exist in the South. And so my understanding is that over the course of 3 or 4 decades, about half of the African American population from the South migrated to the North. So cities like New York, but Detroit, Chicago, Pittsburgh, Buffalo, Rochester, New York, saw a great influx of black people. A book that I want to recommend very highly, which I know Josh is reading, is by a theologian. I may have mentioned this last week, I'm not sure, named James Cone, a black theologian who taught at Union Theological Seminary in New York. The book is titled The Cross and the Lynching Tree, in which the cross and the lynching tree, in which one of his many theses in the book is that the cross was a lynching tree. It was mob justice, mob rule, and finally a mob execution that Jesus went through. And in it, he reflects interestingly on Niebuhr, who was one of the great American theologians who never made that connection between the cross of Jesus and the lynchings that happened in the United States. Today, we are going to move a little bit further into that particular time of turmoil and the major events that occurred in the civil rights movement. Now, I well realize that some of you have lived through this time here in the United States. I did not. We only came to the United States in the mid-90s. But there were many significant events that occurred in the history of the United States that, of course, you are far more familiar with. So please feel free to dive in. If you have reflections or thoughts on your own experience, I want to hear them. I sort of quickly remind you that I am not a scholar on the topic. I am, like most of you, someone who's interested in understanding a little bit of the history of the civil rights movement, the history of black people finally asserting themselves in significant ways to shift the tone, the fabric, and in fact the history of racism in this country. One of the first ones was, of course, in 1954. We talked about it the last time, which was the called Brown versus the Board of Education. It was a significant act that was passed in which, in the height of segregation, there was an, sorry, is that too loud? Okay, you can hear. At the height of segregation in the United States, a lawsuit was filed, and essentially the result of the Supreme Court decision said that it was all right for segregation to continue, that just because blacks and whites were segregated did not indicate an inferiority on the part of black people. Um, One of the great leaders of this particular time who emerged at the Brown versus Board of Education was Thurgood Marshall, one of the most important figures in the civil rights movement, a lawyer, ultimately a Supreme Court justice, the first black Supreme Court justice in the United States Supreme Court. We also saw a little bit of the effects of the Emmett Till murder that happened in 1955, a year later, when this young man was basically lynched. He was actually beaten up, shot, and then thrown into the Tallahatchie River in Alabama, sparking a tremendous movement, especially in the South, but also in the North, towards the civil rights, in the area of civil rights. In 1955, we all know well, this middle-aged or maybe early middle-aged woman stepped onto a bus. She was at that time working for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. And Rosa Parks made history by refusing to give up her seat in the front of the bus and moving back as all black people were expected to. And that sparked a major movement throughout the country. We know that Martin Luther King was able to leverage that movement and get involved in the civil rights struggle at that particular time. Rosa Parks was not planning to start a movement. We do know that she was well versed in the law because, having worked for the NAACP, she was familiar with cases of racial discrimination on a daily basis. And she knew, she was aware that when she refused to give up her seat, there was going to be a stir. Perhaps even she did not imagine just how large that stir would begin to snowball into, where public transportation became an important venue or area of the struggle for rights for black people in the United States. It immediately, of course, led to what was known as the Freedom Riders. This was a time when black men and women would ride on public transportation throughout the South in a way of defying the laws of the land and in asserting their rights to travel. There was also a major campaign that happened in 1963 called the Birmingham Campaign. The Birmingham Campaign was organized by another emerging movement, which was the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, which was a group of people that gathered together and elevated Martin Luther King as their leader. And this again became one more expression of fighting against segregation and discrimination. This was a campaign in which non-violent protests began to spread throughout the South, because that was one of the elemental issues or ways of fighting that Martin Luther King adopted. He believed in the struggle. He believed for the rights that black people should stand up for, but he was majorly committed to nonviolence. More about King in a little bit. The Birmingham campaign also saw brutality being unleashed against an unarmed, non-violent struggle that was occurring throughout the South. We have heard horror stories of the ways in which people were beaten and hosed down, and seeing other kinds of brutalities being expressed upon them. Soon after that, and I'm going through this quickly so that we can move forward, but again, I invite your recollections or comments at any point, because quite honestly, I'm interested in hearing from people who lived through that time. 1963, of course, was a watershed year, because this was also the year in which there was a March on Washington. One of the greatest movements that occurred in the civil rights movement time was when young Martin Luther King Jr. stood up before 250,000 people on the National Mall in front of the Lincoln Memorial. Sorry, that's not the National Mall, is it? Lincoln, in front of the Lincoln Memorial, where he gave this speech that has gone down into the annals of history as one of the greatest speeches ever written, period. In which he talks about this dream that he has of an integrated United States, a dream that he has of seeing a nation that truly lived up to not only to its potential but to its promise, as in its constitution. This was one of the largest political rallies for human rights in American history. And so the March on Washington was covered throughout the world. People had heard about the march that happened, and so people who felt discriminated in other parts of the world rose up as a result of that, because they saw what was coalescing in Washington, D.C. that day as a time when the cry for freedom and for justice and for equality became a worldwide call. And then, of course, we come to the next year, in 1964, when we see the passage of the Civil Rights Act. 1964. But before we come to the Civil Rights Act, 1960, maybe we will do that, the Civil Rights Act. We know that JFK, when he was president, began to get really committed to believing that civil rights was something that black people deserved. He was supportive of the movement, and yet there were some political constraints that were put on people. Tragically, was it 1963 that JFK was assassinated? And November 3rd? Sorry. November 22nd, 1963, when it seemed like the light had gone out of the eyes of America. It clearly is one of those watershed moments, and some of you have lived through that day. Yeah. Yeah. Um, that's right. It is one of those watershed moments when a lot of people recall. For those of us who were not here during that time, 9/11 became a similar sheet anchor date for us. Where were you on that day? And Ajay and I remember well that day. We were living in Manhattan, and we walked down to Lincoln Center, which was a few blocks from where we lived, and the Red Cross building had miles of people snaking around it, waiting in line to give blood. We know that Kennedy was interested, appreciative of, and supportive of the civil rights movement. And then we see a lot of struggle that happens with his successor. Lyndon B. Johnson, in many ways, could not have been more different from JFK. He clearly was not from one of the Boston Brahmins. He was this foul-mouthed Texan with a larger-than-life personality, but he was an amazing worker of people. He had been Speaker of the House and was amazing at the way in which he was able to gather together with people with disparate thoughts and ideas and build them into a coalition. But Johnson struggled seriously in trying to pass the civil rights movement. He, like many people, felt that Martin Luther King Jr. was on the right track, but that it was not yet time for him. How often have we heard that? It's a great thing to do, but I don't think we have arrived at that moment yet. A young Barack Obama was told the same thing. It's Hillary's turn, you know? And many other times have we heard that. But Johnson was interested primarily, I think, in my limited understanding, primarily because it was a way in which this movement of black people throughout the United States that was beginning to coalesce into such a major movement that he knew he could not um, but participate in supporting it. And yet, he saw some of the ramifications of that. His um, interactions with Governor George Wallace were sort of, major historical moments where Wallace, who was clearly an out and out racist and believed that black people should continue to be suppressed, um, had a lot of support in the South, had a lot of support in his home state of Alabama. And he believed that the president should fight tooth and nail and suppress the black people to where they belonged. Um, the Civil Rights Act that was passed ultimately in 1964, of course, declared for the first time in American history that all discrimination is to be banned. All discrimination on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin. It was a major movement that happened there. Of course, we know as we see history unfolding that there's a big difference between passing a legislation and actually seeing it enforced in the day to day living conditions of people. And we still struggle with that today. Sorry? Yeah, you have to change not just the laws of the land, but also change the hearts of people. And when we come next week for our final class, we will reflect a little bit on what it means to look at the increasing yawning gap today between the law of the land and the way in which a government can defy those laws, defy Supreme Court laws that are meant to be in effect today and get away with it. We are living in one of those turbulent times, which I believe that our children and our children's children will ask us, what did you do to fight against that? Yes, Bill. Yeah. And what was the issue there? I want to ask you, were the Republicans for integration or against? Because there was a switch that happened in the Democratic Party because it was the Democrats who were actually people who, at one time earlier, supported segregation and racial oppression. Um, isn't that interesting? Indeed. Thank you. Anne. Yeah. One sec, sir. Can you speak up a little bit if you don't mind? Can you speak a little bit more about that? Yeah. And I think, well, basically, she's saying that over the course of the movement from slavery to freedom and civil rights, um, you can change laws, but you can't always change the hearts of people. And that's a struggle that we still continue to live in. I mean, I think it is fair to say that at that particular time, during at the height of the civil rights movement, there were white people who genuinely believed that black people were inferior. And that is an attitude that cannot be eliminated overnight or even over the course of 100 years. In fact, which is why I will remind us that the first class that we had 2 weeks ago, I asked you, are you a racist? And I know that seems like a sharp, hard question because we all consider ourselves Bay Area, knee jerk liberals who, of course, believe in freedom and in integration of people. And we believe that everybody is equal. But do you really? In your own attitudes? And I'm not just pointing the finger at you, I'm pointing at myself as well. Yeah. Yeah. And I think we all struggle with that. I think if we are really, really brutally honest with ourselves, the seeds of prejudice that we inherited, which are almost a part of our DNA, continue to percolate. And there might just be in each of our hearts a slight difference, a gap between what we believe and how we actually live. And those are the things that we continue to struggle with. Yeah, if only education or wealth could make us less prejudicial, that would be one thing, yeah.
I want to give a plug to a book I recently read, which is a huge bestseller, An Unfinished Love Story by Doris Kearns Goodwin.
Uh huh.
And she's
She's a
one of the
famous
great
historian.
American historians.
Yeah,
And when she was 30, she married a 40-year-old man, Dick Goodwin, and they had a wonderful 40 plus year
yeah,
marriage. And when Dick Goodwin was ailing with cancer, he said, "Honey, we have to clean up the cardboard boxes in the garage." And he was basically his life in the 1960s. He was the lead speechwriter for JFK, for LBJ, and for Bobby Kennedy.
yeah,
And basically, the story is that
Yeah, so there's this checkered history, and I don't know how much, what do we know of what's going on in the hearts of people, but LBJ also saw that as a political opportunity, that it became the right time to give in to the black population, because if you're going to give them civil rights, if you're going to allow them to register, I mean, one of the reasons why black people in the South were fighting tooth and nail for voting rights was because they wanted to take over the government, right? Because they had been suppressed by the white minority by that time, at least in three states, in Louisiana, in South Carolina, and, and Mississippi, where there was a larger black population than white. Those people fought tooth and nail because they wanted to not let go of power. 1965 also saw a major crossing of the bridge, in fact, the Edmund Pettus Bridge in Selma, Alabama, which again became one of the great moments in American history when a group of people throughout the country was stirred enough to begin to believe that they could make a difference. And those kind of moments are seminal in history when people begin to believe that their voice matters and their contribution can actually make a difference. So even before Martin Luther King Jr. stepped into that fray, the Selma to Montgomery March was beginning to gather a lot of momentum. And so, as people like John Lewis and others who were sort of leading that group began to coalesce together in Selma and promised to walk the 50 miles from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery to defy Governor George Wallace's racism, there was a movement that began to occur. And then Martin Luther King was made aware of it and he joined into that struggle. And I just saw the movie Selma the other day and I commend it highly for you because I think it presents Martin Luther King as a flawed man like all of us, but a man who was passionate and believed in the fact that he could make a difference. So the um, Bloody Sunday that happened on the Selma Bridge when people were beaten up, when brutality was unleashed upon black people, it was visible on television screens throughout the country. And that was a particular era where something that was on TV and visible to millions of people across the United States enabled the kind of stirring that happens only via social media in our own time. So television became this great medium through which the struggle of a people and the actual acts that people were willing to engage in led to that particular movement. LBJ had this big fight with Martin Luther King Jr., who showed up in the White House and said, "President, you cannot stop us from marching to Alabama." And you can see LBJ sort of trying to play that game of cajoling him, of threatening him, and defying him. But then ultimately, it was because LBJ allowed that march to happen that the cops finally stepped back, stepped down, and allowed the marchers to go from Selma to Montgomery to register their protest at the state capitol over the ways in which they were being treated. This was also a time in the 60s when the Black Power movement began, right? Stokely Carmichael was one of the leaders of that particular group of people who were somewhat militant in the ways in which they wanted to practice defiance against what was going on. But there were important people. There was Angela Davis, who was interestingly both an activist and a scholar. And she combined those two capacities of hers to move the movement forward. One of the biggest names that emerges then that we will talk about a little later, of course, was Malcolm X. And how that man was able to influence the civil rights movement in many ways, defying what Martin Luther King stood for, which is what we want to look at next. The emergence of these two men, Malcolm X on the one side and Martin Luther King Jr. on the other, of course, was one of the major things that happened during the civil rights movement. Two men who fought for a similar cause and yet had such diverse backgrounds. There were similarities in their lifestyles, and yet there were some major differences. In their upbringing, they couldn't have been more different. Martin Luther King Jr. came from a steady, stable home. He came as one who was deeply influenced by the church, by scripture, and of course, he ultimately went on to study for the ministry, was ordained as a Baptist minister, ultimately went to get a PhD from Boston University, was um, a great orator, a great rhetorician, if you will, a man who was able to string together words, both in terms of using the power of word, but also in his delivery as one of the greatest orators that has ever emerged in the United States of America. Malcolm X was no less skilled. He didn't have anything like the background that Martin Luther King Jr. had. Malcolm X grew up in a broken home. He had barely any relationship with his father. He grew up in foster homes. And of course, he ultimately then, as a teenager, began to engage in petty crime and lived a life of crime. He also tried, like many black men did in that time, to whiten himself, from straightening his hair to trying to use creams to make himself white, because that sense of self hatred was so deeply embedded in the black psyche. But Malcolm X then goes to prison for serving a relatively long time. And it is in prison that he encounters Islam. But not Islam, not in the classic sense of Islam, but of course in a particular version, particular American black version of Islam, which is called the Nation of Islam. You can see that, what Malcolm X had been deprived of throughout his then young life was a sense of discipline. He had nobody that he was accountable to. He was answerable to no one, and lived a life with a sense of reckless abandon, which ultimately led him to prison. And it was in prison, when he encounters Islam through a man who becomes his mentor in prison, is that Islam is a religion of discipline. The word Islam means to submit. Submission is most important in Islam. And suddenly finding out that there is a way in which you can discipline your body and your thinking. You got to pray 5 times a day. It doesn't matter where you are. You kneel down and pray. Something that he learned from his experience with Nation of Islam. Even today, if you notice that sense of discipline is very much a part of a Muslim's life. When Ajung and I have traveled on one of the Gulf airlines, like on Emirates or on Saudia or Etihad, when you enter into the plane, there's a clear marker of which direction Mecca is in. And in fact, there's an indicator where every time it's time for prayer. And you will find faithful Muslims, either in their own seats or trying to find a little corner somewhere in the plane to kneel down and to pray. Malcolm X was deeply influenced by that sense of discipline. And what he learned more than anything else in that prison time was to discipline himself. He became a major proponent of not just Islam, but a Nation of Islam movement, and became really close to the leader of the Nation of Islam, a man by the name of Elijah Muhammad. Over the period of time of Malcolm X's participation and propagation of the Nation of Islam, the membership of Nation of Islam rose from like 5,000 to 100,000 within a couple of years, because he was this magnetic speaker. He was able to stir people up and challenge them to become more faithful disciples. In fact, he became so popular and so beloved that he became a threat to Elijah Muhammad, and he had a major falling out with Elijah Muhammad when he left the Nation of Islam ultimately. What Malcolm X was able to do was to give a vision of his America that seemed to be in sharp contrast to the vision that Martin Luther King Jr. had in mind. Growing up in Atlanta, Martin Luther King Jr. was a brought his faith to bear. He believed deeply in fighting for rights as a part of the struggle of black people. He was deeply influenced by Mahatma Gandhi. He believed in the nonviolence movement because he had seen astonishing results in a country much larger than the United States, where he saw how Gandhi was able to use his authority and his power to wield the kind of nonviolence that had been unheard of until that time. If you remember seeing the movie Gandhi, you would see in his struggles in South Africa, in his early days of the nonviolence movement, he would train people to go up in front of the police, defy them, and invite them to beat them with batons on their heads. And he had other volunteers who would then go alongside, pick up the ones who had been beaten and were bleeding and bruised, lift them out of the way so that the next wave of defiers could move forward. There was something about Gandhi's actions through his nonviolence movement that shook the empire where the sun never sank. Because how do you fight against the people who don't want to fight? And Martin Luther King Jr. was so deeply inspired by this movement, and he believed so passionately as a follower of Jesus that nonviolent non-cooperation was the only way for for black people to achieve their freedom, that he brought it to the United States. And while there were plenty of people like Malcolm X who defied him, there was a growing group of people that he was able to inspire and throw out in a literal sense to do what Gandhi had done in India. And so there were black men and women who would prepare themselves at the beginning of the day to be beaten up. They would call up other people and ask them to be there for them when they went out to get beaten up by the batons. That kind of a movement brought these two people ultimately to head to head. The things that they had in similarity was their ability to inspire people. And throughout we've seen people are either leaders or they are followers. And there was something about Malcolm X and Martin Luther King Jr. that they were clearly seen as leaders who have the capacity to inspire a nation. We see also in the struggles that Martin Luther King Jr. had, Malcolm X was easy for the government to dismiss because he was violent and he was difficult to deal with, and his vision of America was different. In his I Have a Dream speech, Martin Luther King Jr. speaks about a dream where he sees an integrated America. He sees a nation where white people and black people can live together in harmony and in relationship with each other as an integrated nation. Malcolm X's vision was a complete break from the white community, that there would be two separate Americas, a black America and a white America. And Malcolm X was deeply committed to believing that there was no way white people could ever accept black people as equals. And so he built a dream on that basis of segregation. And they clashed on that in pretty significant ways because their visions were so different, even though their hopes and dreams was for an America where there would be integration. In fact, Malcolm X denounced Martin Luther King Jr. as a chump, and he referred to the civil rights leaders under Martin Luther King Jr. as stooges of the white establishment. He did not believe in racial integration. The March on Washington was referred to by Malcolm X as the farce on Washington. And basically he said it was ridiculous that a bunch of black people were so excited about a demonstration, quote, run by whites in front of a statue of a president who had been dead for 100 years and who didn't like us when he was alive anyway, referring to Lincoln. Malcolm X went on to mentor the next leader of the Nation of Islam. This is while he was still with the Nation of Islam, Louis Farrakhan, who we remember hearing about from back in the 90s, who was another major leader of the Nation of Islam. It was he who helped Louis Farrakhan understand the tenets of the Muslim faith, and he groomed him into leadership. But ultimately, because Malcolm broke with Elijah Muhammad, he separated himself from the Nation of Islam movement and took some time off and literally went on a Hajj, which is this annual pilgrimage where Muslims from all around the world are summoned to go to worship and perform the Hajj, the pilgrimage, in the Kaaba, in the sacred, around the sacred stone in the city of Mecca in Saudi Arabia, where Malcolm X had a fresh divine experience. Because what he saw in front of that crowd of hundreds of thousands of people that gather together in Saudi Arabia every year during the Hajj was that there were black Muslims and there were white Muslims and there were brown Muslims. There were Muslims from Indonesia and from India and from Europe who came together. And because of Islam's overt focus on the brotherhood of man, as they referred to it then, as the complete equality between people, that he had a fresh conversion to understanding the genuineness of Islam. And so he forsook the Nation of Islam that he had been a part of and became a classic Sunni Muslim and came back believing much more strongly in what you and I would truly consider to be classic Islam rather than that particular brand of Islam that he had seen. But his dream of a separate America is often invoked. If you remember that mesmerizing first speech that Barack Obama gave at the Democratic National Convention when Bill Clinton invited him to speak, and Barack Obama went on to say, I don't believe in a black America, I don't believe in a white America, I believe in the United States of America. One of those great speeches that launched him from being a junior senator from Illinois to ultimately to the presidency. It was an actual echoing of the civil rights movement in saying, no, above all, we believe in an integrated United States of America. Malcolm X's militancy led him to believe in violence as the only way of being able to achieve the kind of civil rights and freedom that he was fighting for. Tragically, as diverse as these two men were in terms of their upbringing, in their philosophies, they died in very similar ways. 1968, was it? Martin Luther King Jr. at this motel in Memphis where he was shot down. And by this man who admitted to the murder and then recanted, leading to this conspiracy, ongoing conspiracy, a little bit like JFK's, of who exactly it was that killed Martin Luther King Jr. But Malcolm X, shot down by people from the Nation of Islam when he was leading a rally in Harlem in New York City. They both died the same way. Martin Luther King's great inspiration, Mahatma Gandhi himself, was killed in exactly the similar way. Less than a year after India achieved its independence, Gandhi was leading a prayer, and he was assassinated not by the colonialists, British, whom he had driven out of India, but by one of his own people. It was a member of the RSS, the Rashtriya Swayam Sevak movement, which was a Hindu nationalist movement. And Nathuram Godse was the name of the assassin. And he assassinated Gandhi because he felt that Gandhi had capitulated to the Muslims' call for a separate nation of Pakistan. So much of the civil rights movement is steeped in a history of violence. And somehow, violence has continued to characterize us as a nation, including today. Um, it's one of the great baffling things for most people from around the world as to why the greatest nation on earth, the most powerful, the most wealthy nation in history, would still allow for the kind of laws that were written 200 years ago for a time when militias ruled, which allowed for guns to be carried by civilians, would still be perpetrated in this country. It's baffling to people around the world. Sadly, we have also been able to export this image of violence that is, in some ways, quintessentially American to the rest of the world today.
Can you repeat that and tell me what that means?
Does somebody else want to?
I mean,
I don't want to be a trasher of.
you're saying that violence is quintessentially American?
I think the American style of violence, I think the right that people have to bear guns and arms is so quintessentially American.
Then describe what the Vikings used to do. If that is
Oh,
that American? So I mean,
so,
basically, the human creature has always figured if I'm bigger and stronger than you, I'm going to kick your butt. That's
yeah,
exactly what's gone on in our history as human creatures, and you can't put it on. I mean, Americans got problems with their history,
but
but I
this is.
wouldn't say it's because of that. It's
So, yeah, comparing it to the Vikings, comparing it historically a different moment is one thing.
I just picked
We,
one group.
no, but I'm talking about contemporary world today. Which other country has such laws that allow people to bear arms to the kind of level at which America does? No other nation on earth. If you're comparing them to the Taliban, if you're comparing them to ISIS, yes, there are similarities. But legally allowing for guns the way America does, quite apart from the the military industrial complex, the manufacturing of guns and armaments, our need for war around the world in order that Halliburton can continue to make money. We are the most violent nation in
agree
history.
with you, but here's the agree. But Switzerland
Yeah.
requires every citizen to have a gun. And they, if they're in charge of being in their army too. Now, you never see Switzerland in a war. They've become this neutral body. But I learned that when I worked for a Swiss company. But basically, this is more human. I would not pin it on one place. I would say that this is a human quality of killing each other.
Okay. Responses one, two, three.
I want to agree with Dennis that this, sadly,
Sadly,
we have to look at our shadow and understand that all of us have that capacity for violence and unspeakable, horrific actions. And I want to share an example. I hope my husband doesn't mind, but in, to agree with you, Millen, because I think the world does view Americans in this way. Well, now not 20 years ago, when Ken was at graduate school back at MIT, and there was an international class of people from around the world in this particular graduate program. He wore a fanny pack, and after he was there a while, one of the participants, who I believe was actually Japanese, said to Ken, "I'm so glad we noticed that what you have in there is a camera, because we all thought it was a gun." That he was carrying a gun in this fanny pack. So I agree with both of you that yes, it's a human characteristic, and sadly around the world, we are looked at as gun-toting cowgirls and cowboys.
Yeah. Josh, then you, then Nancy. Yeah, sorry.
Um, I'm going to agree with you. I think that America has a uniquely violent culture. I think we might have a little bit of a different upbringing coming from like the conservative South. But like there is this idea that like violence is good. Like any like you know people who open carry and people who conceal carry. The
Joy?
I would I would ask people to have an experiment, which I did with people because from Australia, New Zealand, where my family lives, and other countries, told me, "Oh, you come from a violent country. Everybody shoots everybody." That's their perception. So I decided to ask everybody I met if they had guns, and I started with my hairdresser. And he said, "Of course I have a gun. My wife has a gun, and we keep it by our bedside. My wife's a good shot, and my son has a whole closet full of guns, and but it's love." So I didn't ask anybody else.
Good job.
Nancy.
You mentioned
That's
the
it.
Second Amendment being related to militias, and there's a really good piece written by John Paul Stevens several years ago supporting that and saying that was never written with the purpose of individuals
You're right.
holding guns and using them however they felt like using them, but also as violence. I just read this morning the New York Times with Hickson
Oh,
saying
oh God,
we
yes.
have to be as violent as possible. So what if we killed a lot of children and so on? And there are a lot of folks supporting that in the administration right now.
Was Antonin Scalia a supporter of the Second Amendment?
What?
Yeah.
No, you said. Could you
He was
repeat?
pretty.
I said John Paul Stevens,
John Paul
another
Stevens.
speaker.
Yeah, yeah. I got.
I don't remember his
I would imagine that he was a literalist, right? He believed in a literal interpretation of the law. I would imagine that he would be supportive in saying this is what the writers of the Constitution had in mind.
Well, hold on. The interpretation of what that amendment means has changed radically over the last 15 to 20 years.
Yes.
And so you can say, originalist or whatever, you about that that amendment says what it says, but what had been interpreted by the courts for literally more than 200 years was radically different from what it is today. We can't just ignore the fact that that radically changed in the last 200 years with that specific law.
Yeah.
But kind of
Do you mind coming a little closer so we can hear you?
everyone wants to listen. Um, linking racism and also the use of guns in American violence, and who has the right to carry, who has the right to form a militia. And I do believe that America is more inherently violent than other countries, and all that's been said. I also believe, and we have probably all noticed, that there's a great disparity between who is welcome to carry and to carry freely, and if other people come in, they say that person has a gun, call the police. It is not equal, and therefore, I would personally think because it's not equal, it's a right that maybe none of us should have, unless it would be one day beneficial for all of us to have. But one person with a gun is not the same as a person with my skin color with a gun. We are more of a threat. I think everyone's an immediate threat, but we are seen as instantly a threat, and it's our right that we have without being, yeah, violent.
Thanks. Yeah. Sandy.
I think she's making a really good point.
Can you speak up, Sandy?
I think she's making a really good point, which kind of a little bit of a change of subject back to what we were talking about before.
Hmm.
Anne mentioned this as well, and having and back to the subject of civil rights, having grown up in the South during that period of time, I think there's an element of fear that people feel on both sides, whether it's black, white, or whatever,
responsibly. Yeah.
So I think that the fact that people own guns and need to own guns in some parts of the country shouldn't shouldn't say just no guns, but I think the guns in the wrong hands, people who shouldn't have guns, that's a tough one to do. And I know Governor Newsom tried to get a gun act passed that would um, reduce the use of those clips that you can do multiple shots from.
Right, the bump stock, which can make an ordinary rifle into a machine gun. Well, I think it's one of the great conundrums of our time. My, and I'm certainly not a pacifist. I don't. I believe, it was Saint Augustine, 1400 years ago or whatever, believed that there was a place for just war. There are some wars that are just, where evil has to be defeated. It's the reason why Christian leaders wanted to assassinate Hitler. I mean, because in killing one evil man, there would have been protection of millions of people. But I think I'm happy that there was a stirring conversation. I certainly appreciate it. Next week, we're going to look a little bit at the sort of lingering aspects of racism. We're going to look a little bit at our prison industrial complex, where we house um, uh, prisoners in greater proportion than any other nation on earth, including China and Russia. We're living in a time when our laws are still uh, tilted against the black man, who is uh, vastly disproportionately represented in our prison system. It's one of the many expressions of ongoing racism in our country. Our anti immigration bills that we are passing or dealing with as an issue is another expression of ongoing racism. So I want us to look at some of the contemporary issues and invite you all to come participate in that.
I wanted to suggest that, as I love the way you explore history and interpret it and communicate it, but you said something earlier, and my brain went to the Vietnam War and Johnson's role in that, whereas Johnson's role in the civil rights movement was also huge. And I'm wondering, this is a hypothesis that you could explore, did the Vietnam War take away from the civil rights movement? Did that compete with and draw interests away from ultimately the failure or the ongoing failure of pluralism or equal rights?
Yeah, it's interesting.
Well, so according to the Doris Kearns Goodwin book, totally.
What?
According to the Doris Kearns Goodwin book, totally. So LBJ got his whole agenda after, particularly after 1966, on the war on poverty, the Great Society,
Yes, yes.
and the civil lives got completely derailed by Vietnam.
Yes.
And he lost credibility. He diverted his attention
Isn't that what's happening right now with the war in Iran? I mean, we've read that book before. We've been there in the past. I also will say, let's not do away with Robert McNamara and the whiz kids that were brought in to lead the JFK administration. Thank you so much. You've been a wonderful audience.